U.S. History, an OpenStax textbook. Read along with the full text at www.openstax.org. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Chapter 14. Troubled Times. The Tumultuous 1850s.
Introduction.
The heated sectional controversy between the North and the South reached new levels of intensity in the 1850s. Southerners and Northerners grew ever more antagonistic as they debated the expansion of slavery in the West. The notorious confrontation between Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina and Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, depicted in the image above, illustrates the contempt between extremists on both sides. The caning of Sumner in May 1856 followed upon a speech given by Sumner 2 days earlier in which he condemned slavery in no uncertain terms, declaring,
"Admitting Kansas as a slave state is the rape of a virgin territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery, and it may be clearly traced to a depraved longing for a new slave state, the hideous offspring of such a crime, in the hope of adding to the power of slavery in the national government."
Sumner criticized pro-slavery legislators, particularly attacking a fellow senator and relative of Preston Brooks. Brooks responded by beating Sumner with a cane, a thrashing that Southerners celebrated as a manly defense of gentlemanly honor and their way of life. The episode highlights the violent clash between pro- and anti-slavery factions in the 1850s, a conflict that would eventually lead to the traumatic unraveling of American democracy and Civil War.
(14.1) The Compromise of 1850. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the contested issues that led to the Compromise of 1850. Describe and analyze the reactions to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act.
At the end of the Mexican-American War, the United States gained a large expanse of Western territory known as the Mexican Cession. The disposition of this new territory was in question. Would the new states be slave states or free soil states? In the long run, the Mexican-American War achieved what abolitionism alone had failed to do. It mobilized many in the North against slavery. Anti-slavery Northerners clung to the idea expressed in the 1846 Wilmot Proviso. Slavery would not expand into the areas taken and later bought from Mexico. Though the Proviso remained a proposal and never became a law, it defined the sectional division. The Free Soil Party, which formed at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in 1848 and included many members of the failed Liberty Party, made this position the centerpiece of all its political activities, ensuring that the issue of slavery and its expansion remained at the front and center of American political debate. Supporters of the Wilmot Proviso and members of the new Free Soil Party did not want to abolish slavery in the states where it already existed. Rather, free soil advocates demanded that the Western territories be kept free of slavery for the benefit of white laborers who might settle there. They wanted to protect white workers from having to compete with slave labor in the West. Abolitionists, in contrast, looked to destroy slavery everywhere in the United States. Southern extremists, especially wealthy slaveholders, reacted with outrage at this effort to limit slavery's expansion. They argued for the right to bring their enslaved property west, and they vowed to leave the Union if necessary to protect their way of life, meaning the right to enslave people, and ensure that the American empire of slavery would continue to grow. Brokering the compromise. The issue of what to do with the Western territories added to the Republic by the Mexican Cession consumed Congress in 1850. Other controversial matters, which had been simmering over time, complicated the problem further. Chief among these issues were the slave trade in the District of Columbia, which anti-slavery advocates hoped to end, and the fugitive slave laws, which Southerners wanted to strengthen. The border between Texas and New Mexico remained contested because many Texans hoped to enlarge their state further, and finally, the issue of California had not been resolved. California was the crown jewel of the Mexican Cession, and following the discovery of gold, it was flush with thousands of emigrants. By most estimates, however, it would be a free state, since the former Mexican ban on slavery still remained in force, and slavery had not taken root in California. The map below shows the disposition of land before the 1850 Compromise. The presidential election of 1848 did little to solve the problems resulting from the Mexican Cession. Both the Whigs and the Democrats attempted to avoid addressing the issue of slavery publicly as much as possible. The Democrats nominated Lewis Cass of Michigan, a supporter of the idea of popular sovereignty, or letting the people in the territories decide the issue of whether or not to permit slavery based on majority rule. The Whigs nominated General Zachary Taylor, a slaveholder from Louisiana, who had achieved national prominence as a military hero in the Mexican-American War. Taylor did not take a personal stand on any issue and remained silent throughout the campaign. The fledgling Free Soil Party put forward former President Martin Van Buren as their candidate. The Free Soil Party attracted Northern Democrats who supported the Wilmot Proviso, Northern Whigs who rejected Taylor because he was a slaveholder, former members of the Liberty Party, and other abolitionists. Both the Whigs and the Democrats ran different campaigns in the North and South. In the North, all three parties attempted to win voters with promises of keeping the territories free of slavery, while in the South, Whigs and Democrats promised to protect slavery in the territories. For Southern voters, the slaveholder Taylor appeared the natural choice. In the North, the Free Soil Party took votes away from Whigs and Democrats and helped to ensure Taylor's election in 1848. As president, Taylor sought to diffuse the sectional controversy as much as possible, and, above all else, to preserve the Union. Although Taylor was born in Virginia before relocating to Kentucky and enslaved more than 100 people by the late 1840s, he did not push for slavery's expansion into the Mexican Cession. However, the California Gold Rush made California's statehood into an issue demanding immediate attention. In 1849, after California residents adopted a state constitution prohibiting slavery, President Taylor called on Congress to admit California and New Mexico as free states, a move that infuriated Southern defenders of slavery who argued for the right to bring their enslaved property wherever they chose. Taylor, who did not believe slavery could flourish in the arid lands of the Mexican Cession because the climate prohibited plantation-style farming, proposed that the Wilmot Proviso be applied to the entire area. In Congress, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, a veteran of congressional conflicts, offered a series of resolutions addressing the list of issues related to slavery and its expansion. Clay's resolutions called for the admission of California as a free state, no restrictions on slavery in the rest of the Mexican Cession, a rejection of the Wilmot Proviso and the Free Soil Party's position, a boundary between New Mexico and Texas that did not expand Texas, an important matter since Texas allowed slavery and a larger Texas meant more opportunities for the expansion of slavery, payment of outstanding Texas debts from the Lone Star Republic days, and the end of the slave trade, but not of slavery, in the nation's capital, coupled with a more robust federal fugitive slave law. Clay presented these proposals as an omnibus bill, that is, one that would be voted on its totality. Clay's proposals ignited a spirited and angry debate that lasted for 8 months. The resolution calling for California to be admitted as a free state aroused the wrath of the aged and deathly ill John C. Calhoun, the elder statesman for the pro-slavery position. Calhoun, too sick to deliver a speech, had his friend Virginia Senator James Mason present his assessment of Clay's resolutions and the current state of sectional strife. In Calhoun's eyes, blame for the stalemate fell squarely on the North, which stood in the way of Southern and American prosperity by limiting the zones where slavery could flourish. Calhoun called for a vigorous federal law to ensure that escaped enslaved people were returned to their enslavers. He also proposed a constitutional amendment specifying a dual presidency, one office that would represent the South and another for the North, a suggestion that hinted at the possibility of disunion. Calhoun's argument portrayed an embattled South faced with continued Northern aggression, a line of reasoning that only furthered the sectional divide. Several days after Mason delivered Calhoun's speech, Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster countered Calhoun in his 7th of March speech. Webster called for national unity, famously declaring that he spoke not as a Massachusetts man, not as a Northern man, but as an American. Webster asked Southerners to end threats of disunion and requested that the North stop antagonizing the South by harping on the Wilmot Proviso. Like Calhoun, Webster also called for a new federal law to ensure the return of escaped enslaved people. Webster's efforts to compromise led many abolitionist sympathizers to roundly denounce him as a traitor. Whig Senator William H. Seward, who aspired to be president, declared that slavery, which he characterized as incompatible with the assertion in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, would one day be extinguished in the United States. Seward's speech, in which he invoked the idea of a higher moral law than the Constitution, secured his reputation in the Senate as an advocate of abolition. The speeches made in Congress were published in the nation's newspapers, and the American public followed the debates with great interest, anxious to learn how the issues of the day, especially the potential advance of slavery, would be resolved. Colorful reports of wrangling in Congress further piqued public interest. Indeed, it was not uncommon for arguments to devolve into fistfights or worse. One of the most astonishing episodes of the debate occurred in April 1850, when a quarrel erupted between Missouri Democratic Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who by the time of the debate had become a critic of slavery, despite being an enslaver, and Mississippi Democratic Senator Henry S. Foote. When the burly Benton appeared ready to assault Foote, the Mississippi senator drew his pistol. President Taylor and Henry Clay, whose resolutions had begun the verbal fireworks in the Senate, had no patience for each other. Clay had long harbored ambitions for the White House, and, for his part, Taylor resented Clay and disapproved of his resolutions. With neither side willing to budge, the government stalled on how to resolve the disposition of the Mexican Cession and the other issues of slavery. The drama only increased when on July 4, 1850, President Taylor became gravely ill, reportedly after eating an excessive amount of fruit washed down with milk. He died 5 days later, and Vice President Millard Fillmore became president. Unlike his predecessor, who many believed would be opposed to a compromise, Fillmore worked with Congress to achieve a solution to the crisis of 1850. In the end, Clay stepped down as leader of the compromise effort in frustration, and Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas pushed 5 separate bills through Congress, collectively composing the Compromise of 1850. First, as advocated by the South, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that provided federal money, or bounties, to slave catchers. Second, to balance this concession to the South, Congress admitted California as a free state, a move that cheered anti-slavery advocates and abolitionists in the North. Third, Congress settled the contested boundary between New Mexico and Texas by favoring New Mexico and not allowing for an enlarged Texas, another outcome pleasing to the North. In return, the federal government paid the debts Texas had incurred as an independent republic. Fourth, anti-slavery advocates welcomed Congress's ban on the slave trade in Washington, D.C. although slavery continued to thrive in the nation's capital. Finally, on the thorny issue of whether slavery would expand into the territories, Congress avoided making a direct decision and instead relied on the principle of popular sovereignty. This put the onus on residents of the territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. Popular sovereignty followed the logic of American democracy. Majorities in each territory would decide the territory's laws. The compromise, however, further exposed the sectional divide as votes on the bills divided along strict regional lines. Most Americans breathed a sigh of relief over the deal brokered in 1850, choosing to believe it had saved the Union. Rather than resolving divisions between the North and the South, however, the compromise stood as a truce in an otherwise white-hot sectional conflict. Tensions in the nation remained extremely high. Indeed, Southerners held several conventions after the compromise to discuss ways to protect the South. At these meetings, extremists who called for secession found themselves in the minority, since most Southerners committed themselves to staying in the Union, but only if slavery remained in the states where it already existed, and if no effort was made to block its expansion into areas where citizens wanted it, thereby applying the idea of popular sovereignty. The Fugitive Slave Act and its consequences. The hope that the Compromise of 1850 would resolve the sectional crisis proved short-lived when the Fugitive Slave Act turned into a major source of conflict. The federal law imposed heavy fines and prison sentences on Northerners and Midwesterners who aided those who had escaped their captivity or refused to join posses to catch freedom seekers. Many Northerners felt the law forced them to act as slave catchers against their will. The law also established a new group of federal commissioners who would decide the fate of freedom seekers brought before them. In some instances, slave catchers even brought in free Northern black people, prompting abolitionist societies to step up their efforts to prevent kidnappings. The commissioners had a financial incentive to send recaptured enslaved and free black people to the slaveholding South, since they received $10 for every African American sent to the South and only $5 if they decided the person who came before them was actually free. The commissioners used no juries, and the alleged runaways could not testify in their own defense. The operation of the law further alarmed Northerners and confirmed for many the existence of a slave power, that is, a minority of elite slaveholders who wielded a disproportionate amount of power over the federal government, shaping domestic and foreign policies to suit their interests. Despite Southerners' repeated insistence on states' rights, the Fugitive Slave Act showed that slaveholders were willing to use the power of the federal government to bend people in other states to their will. While rejecting the use of federal power to restrict the expansion of slavery, pro-slavery, Southerners turned to the federal government to protect and promote the institution of slavery. The actual number of freedom seekers who were not captured within a year of escaping remained very low, perhaps no more than 1,000 per year in the early 1850s. Most stayed in the South, hiding in plain sight among free black people in urban areas. Nonetheless, Southerners feared the influence of a vast underground railroad, the network of Northern white and free black people who sympathized with escapees and provided safe houses and safe passage from the South. Quakers, who had long been troubled by slavery, were especially active in this network. It is unclear how many enslaved people escaped through the Underground Railroad, but historians believe that between 50,000 and 100,000 used the network in their bids for freedom. Meanwhile, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act greatly increased the perils of being captured. For many thousands of freedom seekers, escaping the United States completely by going to southern Ontario, Canada, where slavery had been abolished, offered the best chance of a better life beyond the reach of slaveholders. Harriet Tubman, one of the thousands of enslaved people who made their escape through the Underground Railroad distinguished herself for her efforts in helping other enslaved men and women escape. Born a slave in Maryland around 1822, Tubman, who suffered greatly under slavery but found solace in Christianity, made her escape in the late 1840s. She returned to the South more than a dozen times to lead other enslaved people, including her family and friends, along the Underground Railroad to freedom. The Fugitive Slave Act provoked widespread reactions in the North. Some abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass, believed that standing up against the law necessitated violence. In Boston and elsewhere, abolitionists tried to protect fugitives from federal authorities. One case involved Anthony Burns, who had escaped slavery in Virginia in 1853 and made his way to Boston. When federal officials arrested Burns in 1854, abolitionists staged a series of mass demonstrations and a confrontation at the courthouse. Despite their best efforts, however, Burns was returned to Virginia when President Franklin Pierce supported the Fugitive Slave Act with federal troops. Boston abolitionists eventually bought Burns's freedom. For many Northerners, however, the Burns incident combined with Pierce's response only amplified their sense of a conspiracy of Southern power. The most consequential reaction against the Fugitive Slave Act came in the form of a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. In it, author Harriet Beecher Stowe, born in Connecticut, made use of enslaved people's stories she had heard firsthand after marrying and moving to Ohio, then on the country's western frontier. Her novel first appeared as a series of stories in a Free Soil newspaper, The National Era, in 1851, and was published as a book the following year. Stowe told the tale of enslaved people who were sold by their Kentucky enslaver. While Uncle Tom is indeed sold down the river, young Eliza escapes with her baby. The story highlighted the idea that slavery was a sin because it destroyed families, ripping children from their parents and husbands and wives from one another. Stowe also emphasized the ways in which slavery corrupted white citizens. The cruelty of some of the novel's white slaveholders who genuinely believe that enslaved people don't feel things the way that white people do, and the brutality of the slave dealer Simon Legree, who beats enslaved people and sexually exploits an enslaved woman, demonstrate the dehumanizing effect of the institution even on those who benefit from it. Stowe's novel proved a runaway bestseller and was the most read novel of the 19th century, inspiring multiple theatrical productions and musical compositions. It was translated into 60 languages and remains in print to this day. Its message about the evils of slavery helped convince many Northerners of the righteousness of the cause of abolition. The novel also demonstrated the power of women to shape public opinion. Stowe and other American women believed they had a moral obligation to mold the conscience of the United States, even though they could not vote. The backlash against the Fugitive Slave Act, fueled by Uncle Tom's Cabin and well-publicized cases like that of Anthony Burns, also found expression in personal liberty laws passed by 8 northern state legislatures. These laws emphasized that the state would provide legal protection to any arrested freedom seekers, including the right to trial by jury. The personal liberty laws stood as a clear-cut example of the North's use of states' rights in opposition to federal power, while providing further evidence to Southerners that Northerners had no respect for the Fugitive Slave Act or slaveholders' property rights.
Defining American. Harriet Tubman, an American Moses? Harriet Tubman was a legendary figure in her own time and beyond. An escaped enslaved person herself, she returned to the South 13 times to help over 300 other freedom seekers through the Underground Railroad to liberty in the North. In 1869, printer William J. Moses published Sarah H. Bradford's Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. Bradford was a writer and biographer who had known Tubman's family for years. The excerpt below is from the beginning of her book, which she updated in 1886 under the title Harriet, the Moses of Her People.
It is proposed in this little book to give a plain and unvarnished account of some scenes and adventures in the life of a woman who, though one of Earth's lowly ones, and of dark-hued skin, has shown an amount of heroism in her character rarely possessed by those of any station in life. Her name, we say it advisedly and without exaggeration, deserves to be handed down to posterity side by side with the names of Joan of Arc, Grace Darling, and Florence Nightingale, for not one of these women has shown more courage and power of endurance in facing danger and death to relieve human suffering than has this woman in her heroic and successful endeavors to reach and save all whom she might of her oppressed and suffering race, and to pilot them from the land of bondage to the promised land of liberty. Well has she been called Moses, for she has been a leader and deliverer unto hundreds of her people. Sarah H. Bradford, Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman.
How does Bradford characterize Tubman? What language does Bradford use to tie religion into the fight for freedom? (14.2) The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Republican Party. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the political ramifications of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Describe the founding of the Republican Party.
In the early 1850s, the United States sectional crisis had abated somewhat, cooled by the Compromise of 1850 and the nation's general prosperity. In 1852, voters went to the polls in a presidential contest between Whig candidate Winfield Scott and Democratic candidate Franklin Pierce. Both men endorsed the Compromise of 1850. Though it was considered unseemly to hit the campaign trail, Scott did so, much to the benefit of Pierce, as Scott's speeches focused on 40-year-old battles during the War of 1812 and the weather. In New York, Scott, known as Old Fuss and Feathers, talked about a thunderstorm that did not occur and greatly confused the crowd. In Ohio, a cannon firing to herald Scott's arrival killed a spectator. Pierce was a supporter of the Young America movement of the Democratic Party, which enthusiastically anticipated extending democracy around the world and annexing additional territory for the United States. Pierce did not take a stance on the slavery issue, helped by Scott's blunders and the fact that he had played no role in the bruising political battles of the past 5 years. Pierce won the election. The brief period of tranquility between the North and South did not last long, however. It came to an end in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act led to the formation of a new political party, the Republican Party, that committed itself to ending the further expansion of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. The relative calm over the sectional issue was broken in 1854 over the issue of slavery in the territory of Kansas. Pressure had been building among Northerners to organize the territory west of Missouri and Iowa, which had been admitted to the Union as a free state in 1846. This pressure came primarily from Northern farmers, who wanted the federal government to survey the land and put it up for sale. Promoters of a transcontinental railroad were also pushing for this westward expansion. Southerners, however, had long opposed the Wilmot Proviso's stipulation that slavery should not expand into the West. By the 1850s, many in the South were also growing resentful of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which established the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel as the geographical boundary of slavery on the north-south axis. Pro-slavery Southerners now contended that popular sovereignty should apply to all territories, not just Utah and New Mexico. They argued for the right to bring their enslaved property wherever they chose. Attitudes towards slavery in the 1850s were represented by a variety of regional factions. For 3 decades, the abolitionists remained a minority, but they had a significant effect on American society by bringing the evils of slavery into the public consciousness. In 1840, the Liberty Party was the first political organization to campaign for abolition. This group sought to work within the existing political system, a strategy Garrison and others rejected. Meanwhile, the Free Soil Party committed itself to ensuring that white laborers would find work in newly acquired territories and not have to compete with unpaid enslaved people. By the 1850s, some abolitionists advocated the use of violence against slaveholders. It is important to note that, even among those who opposed the expansion of slavery in the West, very different attitudes toward slavery existed. Some anti-slavery Northerners wanted the West to be the best country for poor white people to go and seek opportunity. They did not want white workers to have to compete with slave labor, a contest that they believed demeaned white labor. Radical abolitionists, in contrast, envisioned the end of all slavery and a society of equality between black and white people. Others opposed slavery in principle, but believed that the best approach was colonization. That is, settling freed enslaved people in a colony in Africa. The growing political movement to address the issue of slavery stiffened the resolve of Southern slaveholders to defend themselves and their society at all costs. Prohibiting slavery's expansion, they argued, ran counter to basic American property rights. As abolitionists fanned the flames of anti-slavery sentiment, Southerners solidified their defense of their enormous investment in human chattel. Across the country, people of all political stripes worried that the nation's arguments would cause irreparable rifts in the country. As these different factions were agitating for the settlement of Kansas and Nebraska, leaders of the Democratic Party in 1853 and 1854 sought to bind their party together in the aftermath of intra-party fights over the distribution of patronage jobs. Illinois Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas believed he had found a solution, the Kansas-Nebraska bill, that would promote party unity and also satisfy his colleagues from the South, who detested the Missouri Compromise line. In January 1854, Douglas introduced the bill. The act created two territories, Kansas, directly west of Missouri, and Nebraska, west of Iowa. The act also applied the principle of popular sovereignty, dictating that the people of these territories would decide for themselves whether to adopt slavery. In a concession crucial to many Southerners, the proposed bill would also repeal the 36-degree 30 minutes line from the Missouri Compromise. Douglas hoped his bill would increase his political capital and provide a step forward on his quest for the presidency. Douglas also wanted the territory organized in hopes of placing the eastern terminus of a transcontinental railroad in Chicago, rather than St. Louis or New Orleans. After heated debates, Congress narrowly passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In the House of Representatives, the bill passed by a mere 3 votes, 113 to 110. This move had major political consequences. The Democrats divided along sectional lines as a result of the bill, and the Whig Party, in decline in the early 1850s, found its political power slipping further. Most important, the Kansas-Nebraska Act gave rise to the Republican Party, a new political party that attracted Northern Whigs, Democrats who shunned the Kansas-Nebraska Act, members of the Free Soil Party, and assorted abolitionists. Indeed, with the formation of the Republican Party, the Free Soil Party ceased to exist. The new Republican Party pledged itself to preventing the spread of slavery into the territories and railed against the slave power, infuriating the South. As a result, the party became a solidly Northern political organization. As never before, the U.S. political system was polarized along sectional fault lines. Bleeding Kansas. In 1855 and 1856, pro- and anti-slavery activists flooded Kansas with the intention of influencing the popular sovereignty rule of the territories. Pro-slavery Missourians who crossed the border to vote in Kansas became known as border ruffians. These gained the advantage by winning the territorial elections, most likely through voter fraud and illegal vote counting. By some estimates, up to 60% of the votes cast in Kansas were fraudulent. Once in power, the pro-slavery legislature, meeting at Lecompton, Kansas, drafted a pro-slavery constitution known as the Lecompton Constitution. It was supported by President Buchanan, but opposed by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. The majority in Kansas, however, were free soilers who seethed at the border ruffians' co-opting of the democratic process. Many had come from New England to ensure a numerical advantage over the border ruffians. The New England Emigrant Aid Society, a northern anti-slavery group, helped fund these efforts to halt the expansion of slavery into Kansas and beyond. In 1856, clashes between anti-slavery free soilers and border ruffians came to a head in Lawrence, Kansas. The town had been founded by the New England Emigrant Aid Society, which funded anti-slavery settlement in the territory and were determined that Kansas should be a free soil state. Pro-slavery immigrants from Missouri were equally determined that no abolitionist tyrants or Negro thieves would control the territory. In the spring of 1856, several of Lawrence's leading anti-slavery citizens were indicted for treason, and Federal Marshal Israel Donaldson called for a posse to help make arrests. He did not have trouble finding volunteers from Missouri. When the posse, which included Douglas County Sheriff Samuel Jones, arrived outside Lawrence, the anti-slavery town's Committee of Safety agreed on a policy of non-resistance. Most of those who were indicted fled. Donaldson arrested 2 men without incident and dismissed the posse. However, Jones, who had been shot during an earlier confrontation in the town, did not leave. On May 21st, falsely claiming that he had a court order to do so, Jones took command of the posse and rode into town armed with rifles, revolvers, cutlasses, and Bowie knives. At the head of the procession, 2 flags flew, an American flag and a flag with a crouching tiger. Other banners followed, bearing the words Southern Rights and the superiority of the white race. In the rear were 5 artillery pieces, which were dragged to the center of town. The posse smashed the presses of the 2 newspapers, Herald of Freedom and the Kansas Free State, and burned down the deserted Free State Hotel. When the posse finally left, Lawrence residents found themselves unharmed but terrified. The next morning, a man named John Brown and his sons, who were on their way to provide Lawrence with reinforcements, heard the news of the attack. Brown, a strict, God-fearing Calvinist and staunch abolitionist, once remarked that God had raised him up on purpose to break the jaws of the wicked. Disappointed that the citizens of Lawrence did not resist the slave hounds of Missouri, Brown opted not to go to Lawrence, but to the homes of pro-slavery settlers near Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas. The group of 7, including Brown's 4 sons, arrived on May 24, 1856, and announced they were the Northern Army that had come to serve justice. They burst into the cabin of pro-slavery Tennessean James Doyle and marched him and 2 of his sons off, sparing the youngest at the desperate request of Doyle's wife, Mahala. 100 yards down the road, Owen and Salmon Brown hacked their captives to death with broadswords, and John Brown shot a bullet into Doyle's forehead. Before the night was done, the Browns visited 2 more cabins and brutally executed 2 other pro-slavery settlers. None of those executed enslaved any people or had had anything to do with the raid on Lawrence. Brown's actions precipitated a new wave of violence. All told, the guerrilla warfare between pro-slavery, border ruffians, and anti-slavery forces, which would continue and even escalate during the Civil War, resulted in over 150 deaths and significant property loss. The events in Kansas served as an extreme reply to Douglas's proposition of popular sovereignty. As the violent clashes increased, Kansas became known as Bleeding Kansas. Anti-slavery advocates' use of force carved out a new direction for some who opposed slavery. Distancing themselves from William Lloyd Garrison and other pacifists, Brown and fellow abolitionists believed the time had come to fight slavery with violence. The violent hostilities associated with Bleeding Kansas were not limited to Kansas itself. It was the controversy over Kansas that prompted the caning of Charles Sumner, introduced at the beginning of this chapter with the political cartoon Southern Chivalry, Argument versus Clubs. Note the title of the cartoon. It lampoons the Southern ideal of chivalry, the code of behavior that Preston Brooks believed he was following in his attack on Sumner. In Sumner's Crime Against Kansas speech, he went much further than politics, filling his verbal attack with allusions to sexuality by singling out fellow Senator Andrew Butler from South Carolina, a zealous supporter of slavery and Brooks's uncle. Sumner insulted Butler by comparing slavery to prostitution, declaring,
"Of course, Butler has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery."
Because Butler was aged, it was his nephew, Brooks, who sought satisfaction for Sumner's attack on his family and Southern honor. Brooks did not challenge Sumner to a duel. By choosing to beat him with a cane instead, he made it clear that he did not consider Sumner a gentleman. Many in the South rejoiced over Brooks's defense of slavery, Southern society, and family honor, sending him hundreds of canes to replace the one he had broken, assaulting Sumner. The attack by Brooks left Sumner incapacitated physically and mentally for a long period of time. Despite his injuries, the people of Massachusetts re-elected him.
Defining American. The Lecompton Constitution. Kansas was home to no fewer than 4 state constitutions in its early years. Its first constitution, the Topeka Constitution, would have made Kansas a free soil state. A pro-slavery legislature, however, created the 1857 Lecompton Constitution to enshrine the institution of slavery in the new Kansas-Nebraska territories. In January 1858, Kansas voters defeated the proposed Lecompton Constitution, excerpted below, with an overwhelming margin of 10,226 to 138. Article 7. Slavery. Section 1. The right of property is before and higher than any constitutional sanction, and the right of the owner of a slave to such slave and its increase is the same and as inviolable as the right of the owner of any property whatever. Section 2. The legislature shall have no power to pass laws for the emancipation of slaves without the consent of the owners, or without paying the owners previous to their emancipation a full equivalent in money for the slaves so emancipated. They shall have no power to prevent immigrants to the state from bringing with them such persons as are deemed slaves by the laws of any one of the United States or territories, so long as any person of the same age or description shall be continued in slavery by the laws of this state, provided that such person or slave be the bona fide property of such immigrants. How are slaves defined in the 1857 Kansas Constitution? How does this Constitution safeguard the rights of slaveholders?
The presidential election of 1856. The electoral contest in 1856 took place in a transformed political landscape. A third political party appeared, the Anti-Immigrant American Party, a formerly secretive organization with the nickname the Know Nothing Party, because its members denied knowing anything about it. By 1856, the American or Know Nothing Party had evolved into a national force committed to halting further immigration. Its members were especially opposed to the immigration of Irish Catholics, whose loyalty to the Pope, they believed, precluded their loyalty to the United States. On the West Coast, they opposed the entry of immigrant laborers from China who were thought to be too foreign to ever assimilate into a white America. The election also featured the new Republican Party, which offered John C. Fremont as its candidate. Republicans accused the Democrats of trying to nationalize slavery through the use of popular sovereignty in the West, a view captured in the 1856 political cartoon Forcing Slavery Down the Throat of a Free Soiler. The cartoon features the image of a free soiler settler tied to the Democratic Party platform, while Senator Douglas, author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and President Pierce force an enslaved person down his throat. Note that the enslaved person cries out, "Murder! Help! Neighbors, help! Oh, my poor wife and children," a reference to the abolitionists' argument that slavery destroyed families. The Democrats offered James Buchanan as their candidate. Buchanan did not take a stand on either side of the issue of slavery, Rather, he attempted to please both sides. His qualification, in the minds of many, was that he was out of the country when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. In the above political cartoon, Buchanan, along with Democratic Senator Lewis Cass, holds down the Free Soil Advocate. Buchanan won the election, but Fremont garnered more than 33% of the popular vote, an impressive return for a new party. The Whigs had ceased to exist and had been replaced by the Republican Party. Know-Nothings also transferred their allegiance to the Republicans because the new party also took an anti-immigrant stance, a move that further boosted the new party's standing. The Democrats courted the Catholic immigrant vote. The Republican Party was a thoroughly Northern party. No Southern delegate voted for Fremont.
.3 The Dred Scott Decision and Sectional Strife. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the importance of the Supreme Court's Dred Scott ruling. Discuss the principles of the Republican Party as expressed by Abraham Lincoln in 1858.
As president, Buchanan confronted a difficult and volatile situation. The nation needed a strong personality to lead it, and Buchanan did not possess this trait. The violence in Kansas demonstrated that applying popular sovereignty, the democratic principle of majority rule, to the territory offered no solution to the national battle over slavery. A decision by the Supreme Court in 1857, which concerned the enslaved Dred Scott, only deepened the crisis. Dred Scott. In 1857, just days after President Buchanan took the oath of office, the Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott, born with slave status in Virginia in 1795, had been one of the thousands forced to relocate as a result of the massive internal slave trade and taken to Missouri, where slavery had been adopted as part of the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, Scott's owner took him first to Illinois and then to the Wisconsin Territory. However, both of those regions were part of the Northwest Territory, where the 1787 Northwest Ordinance had prohibited slavery. When Scott returned to Missouri, he attempted to buy his freedom. After his owner refused, he sought relief in the state courts, arguing that by virtue of having lived in areas where slavery was banned, he should be free. In a complicated set of legal decisions, a jury found that Scott, along with his wife and 2 children, were free. However, on appeal from Scott's owner, the state superior court reversed the decision, and the Scotts remained enslaved. Scott then became the property of John Sanford. His name was misspelled as Sandford in later court documents, who lived in New York. He continued his legal battle, and because the issue involved Missouri and New York, the case fell under the jurisdiction of the federal court. In 1854, Scott lost in federal court and appealed to the United States Supreme Court. In 1857, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, a former slaveholder who had freed those he had enslaved, handed down its decision. On the question of whether Scott was free, the Supreme Court decided he remained enslaved. The court then went beyond the specific issue of Scott's freedom to make a sweeping and momentous judgment about the status of black people, both free and enslaved. Per the court, black people could never be citizens of the United States. Further, the court ruled that Congress had no authority to stop or limit the spread of slavery into American territories. This pro-slavery ruling explicitly made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Implicitly, it made Douglas's popular sovereignty unconstitutional. The Dred Scott decision infuriated Republicans by rendering their goal, to prevent slavery's spread into the territories, unconstitutional. To Republicans, the decision offered further proof of the reach of the South's slave power, which now apparently extended even to the Supreme Court. The decision also complicated life for Northern Democrats, especially Stephen Douglas, who could no longer sell popular sovereignty as a symbolic concession to Southerners from Northern voters. Few Northerners favored slavery's expansion westward.
Defining American. Roger Taney on Dred Scott v. Sanford. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court ended years of legal battles when it ruled that Dred Scott, an enslaved person who had resided in several free states, should remain enslaved. The decision, written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, also stated that black people could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to limit the spread of slavery. The excerpt below is from Taney's decision.
A free Negro of the African race, whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves, is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. The only two clauses in the Constitution which point to this race treat them as persons whom it was morally lawfully to deal in as articles of property and to hold as slaves. Every citizen has a right to take with him into the territory any article of property which the Constitution of the United States recognizes as property. The Constitution of the United States recognizes slaves as property and pledges the federal government to protect it, and Congress cannot exercise any more authority over property of that description than it may constitutionally exercise over property of any other kind. Prohibiting a citizen of the United States from taking with him his slaves when he removes to the territory is an exercise of authority over private property which is not warranted by the Constitution, and the removal of the plaintiff, Dred Scott, by his owner to that territory gave him no title to freedom.
How did the Supreme Court define Dred Scott? How did the court interpret the Constitution on this score?
The Lincoln-Douglas debates. The turmoil in Kansas, combined with the furor over the Dred Scott decision, provided the background for the 1858 senatorial contest in Illinois between Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas and Republican hopeful Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln and Douglas engaged in 7 debates before huge crowds that met to hear the two men argue the central issue of slavery and its expansion. Newspapers throughout the United States published their speeches. Whereas Douglas already enjoyed national recognition, Lincoln remained largely unknown before the debates. These appearances provided an opportunity for him to raise his profile with both Northerners and Southerners. Douglas portrayed the Republican Party as an abolitionist effort, one that aimed to bring about miscegenation or race mixing through sexual relations or marriage. The Black Republicans, Douglas declared, posed a dangerous threat to the Constitution. Indeed, because Lincoln declared the nation could not survive if the slave state-free state division continued, Douglas claimed the Republicans aimed to destroy what the founders had created. For his part, Lincoln said,
"A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south."
Lincoln interpreted the Dred Scott decision and the Kansas-Nebraska Act as efforts to nationalize slavery. That is, to make it legal everywhere from New England to the Midwest and beyond. During the debates, Lincoln demanded that Douglas explain whether or not he believed that the 1857 Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case trumped the right of a majority to prevent the expansion of slavery under the principle of popular sovereignty. Douglas responded to Lincoln during the second debate at Freeport, Illinois. In what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, Douglas adamantly upheld popular sovereignty, declaring,
It matters not what way the Supreme Court may hereafter decide, as to the abstract question whether slavery may or may not go into a territory under the Constitution, the people have the lawful means to introduce it or exclude it as they please.
The Freeport Doctrine antagonized Southerners who supported slavery and caused a major rift in the Democratic Party. The doctrine did help Douglas in Illinois, however, where most voters opposed the further expansion of slavery. The Illinois legislature selected Douglas over Lincoln for the Senate, but the debates had the effect of launching Lincoln into the national spotlight. Lincoln had argued that slavery was morally wrong, even as he accepted the racism inherent in slavery. He warned that Douglas and the Democrats would nationalize slavery through the policy of popular sovereignty. Though Douglas had survived the Senate election challenge from Lincoln, his Freeport Doctrine damaged the political support he needed from the Southern Democrats. This helped him to lose the following presidential election, undermining the Democratic Party as a national force.
Defining American, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. On August 21, 1858, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas met in Ottawa, Illinois for the first of 7 debates. People streamed into Ottawa from neighboring counties and from as far away as Chicago. Reporting on the event was strictly partisan, with each of the candidates' supporters claiming victory for their candidate. In this excerpt, Lincoln addresses the issues of equality between black and white people.
Anything that argues me into his idea of perfect social and political equality with the Negro is but a specious and fantastic arrangement of words. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong having the superior position. Notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I hold that he is as much entitled to these as the white man. In the right to eat the bread, without the leave of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man. Lincoln's speech on August 21, 1858, in Ottawa, Illinois.
How would you characterize Lincoln's position on equality between black and white people? What types of equality exist according to Lincoln? (14.4) John Brown and the Election of 1860. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and its results. Analyze the results of the election of 1860.
Events in the late 1850s did nothing to quell the country's sectional unrest, and compromise on the issue of slavery appeared impossible. Lincoln's 1858 speeches during his debates with Douglas made the Republican Party's position well known. Republicans opposed the extension of slavery and believed a slave power conspiracy sought to nationalize the institution. They quickly gained political momentum and took control of the House of Representatives in 1858. Southern leaders were divided on how to respond to Republican success. Southern extremists, known as fire eaters, openly called for secession. Others, like Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, put forward a more moderate approach by demanding constitutional protection of slavery. John Brown. In October 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown and 18 armed men, both black and white, attacked the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. They hoped to capture the weapons there and distribute them among enslaved people to begin a massive uprising that would bring an end to slavery. Brown had already demonstrated during the 1856 Potawatomi attack in Kansas that he had no patience for the nonviolent approach preached by pacifist abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. Born in Connecticut in 1800, Brown spent much of his life in the North, moving from Ohio to Pennsylvania and then upstate New York as his various business ventures failed. To him, Slavery appeared an unacceptable evil that must be purged from the land, and like his Puritan forebears, he believed in using the sword to defeat the ungodly. Brown had gone to Kansas in the 1850s in an effort to stop slavery, and there, he had perpetrated the killings at Pottawatomie. He told other abolitionists of his plan to take Harper's Ferry Armory and initiate a massive slave uprising. Some abolitionists provided financial support, while others, including Frederick Douglass, found the plot suicidal and refused to join. On October 16, 1859, Brown's force easily took control of the Federal Armory, which was unguarded. However, his vision of a mass uprising failed completely. Very few enslaved people lived in the area to rally to Brown's side, and the group found themselves holed up in the Armory's engine house, with townspeople taking shots at them. Federal troops, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, soon captured Brown and his followers. On December 2nd, Brown was hanged by the state of Virginia for treason. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry generated intense reactions in both the South and the North. Southerners grew especially apprehensive of the possibility of other violent plots. They viewed Brown as a terrorist bent on destroying their civilization, and support for secession grew. Their anxiety led several Southern states to pass laws designed to prevent rebellions by the enslaved. It seemed that the worst fears of the South had come true. A hostile majority would stop at nothing to destroy slavery. Was it possible, one resident of Maryland asked, to live under a government, a majority of whose subjects or citizens regard John Brown as a martyr and Christian hero? Many anti-slavery Northerners did in fact consider Brown a martyr to the cause, and those who viewed slavery as a sin saw easy comparisons between him and Jesus Christ. The election of 1860. The election of 1860 threatened American democracy when the elevation of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency inspired secessionists in the South to withdraw their states from the Union. Lincoln's election owed much to the disarray in the Democratic Party. The Dred Scott decision and the Freeport Doctrine had opened up huge sectional divisions among Democrats. Though Brown did not intend it, his raid had furthered the split between Northern and Southern Democrats. Fire-eaters vowed to prevent a Northern Democrat, especially Illinois' Stephen Douglas, from becoming their presidential candidate. These pro-slavery zealots insisted on a Southern Democrat. The Democratic Nominating Convention met in April 1860 in Charleston, South Carolina. However, it broke up after Northern Democrats, who made up a majority of delegates, rejected Jefferson Davis's efforts to protect slavery in the territories. These Northern Democratic delegates knew that supporting Davis on this issue would be very unpopular among the people in their states. A second conference, held in Baltimore, further illustrated the divide within the Democratic Party. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, while Southern Democrats, who met separately, put forward Vice President John Breckinridge from Kentucky. The Democratic Party had fractured into two competing sectional factions. By offering two candidates for president, the Democrats gave the Republicans an enormous advantage. Also hoping to prevent a Republican victory, pro-Unionists from the border states organized the Constitutional Union Party and put up a fourth candidate, John Bell, for president, who pledged to end slavery agitation and preserve the Union but never fully explained how he'd accomplish this objective. In a pro-Lincoln political cartoon of the time, the presidential election is presented as a baseball game. Lincoln stands on home plate. A skunk raises its tail at the other candidates. Holding his nose, Southern Democrat John Breckinridge holds a bat labeled Slavery Extension and declares, "I guess I'd better leave for Kentucky, for I smell something strong around here and begin to think that we are completely skunked." The Republicans nominated Lincoln, and in the November election, he garnered a mere 40% of the popular vote, though he won every northern state except New Jersey. Lincoln's name was blocked from even appearing on many Southern states' ballots by Southern Democrats. More importantly, Lincoln did gain a majority in the Electoral College. The Fire Eaters, however, refused to accept the results. With South Carolina leading the way, Fire Eaters in Southern states began to withdraw formally from the United States in 1860. South Carolinian Mary Boykin Chestnut wrote in her diary about the reaction to the Lincoln's election. "Now that the black radical Republicans have the power," she wrote, "I suppose they will brown us all." Her statement revealed many Southerners' fear that with Lincoln as president, the South could expect more mayhem like the John Brown raid. This has been U.S. History from OpenStax. OpenStax textbooks and this free audiobook are covered under a Creative Commons license. The full text is available at www.openstax.org. This project was made possible by CC Echo, the California Consortium for Equitable Change in Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Open Education Resources. You can learn more about CC Echo by visiting the link in this episode's show notes. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Instructors can even download a course shell to embed these recordings in Canvas courses. Learn more by visiting www.openaudio.us. Did you find this audiobook helpful? If so, let us know by leaving a comment and sharing this recording with a colleague or a friend.